Please be seated, everyone. Good evening, members and officers of the Council and members of the press and public. I welcome you to this meeting of the Council. Before we start, we have a few basic instructions to go through. Now, if the fire alarm is activated, please vacate the offices via the stairs, either through the security doors to my right or opposite the lifts in the foyer. Please do not use the lifts. Please assemble in Hawley Square on the green. Officers will assist you and advise where it is deemed safe to return to this chamber. Now, with respect to filming of the meeting, I would advise that if filming takes place, anyone in attendance in the public area may have their image captured. I urge anyone filming proceedings to avoid filming members of the public, particularly if there are children present. Does anyone intend to film the meeting? I can see one hand indicated. So we do have filming. Is there two? We've got two hands. Thank you. Right, since it's a yes, any member of the public who objects to the possibility of being filmed may wish to take this opportunity to leave the meeting. Does anyone wish to leave? It would seem not. Now, any filming or recording will not be permitted for any item of business where exempt or confidential information is considered following the exclusion of the press and public from the meeting. There is a restriction on the use of mobile phones. Would everyone present please ensure that their mobile phones are turned to silent and they are not used to make or receive phone calls whilst the meeting is in progress. I, in fact, don't even bring my phone with me. So, there we are. Members, moving on to agenda item 1, apologies for absence. Now, I've received apologies from Councillor Boyd, Councillor Huxley and Councillor Shonk, and I must advise that Councillors Bob and Jill Bayford are away for private reasons, and those who know will send their best wishes on, I'm sure. Are there any other apologies for absence?
Apologies from Councillor Green, Liz Green.
Councillor Liz Green, thank you. Councillor Curry, you indicated. That was your... do I have any... Councillor Piper?
Thank you, Chair. Councillor John Dennis is unwell.
Councillor John Dennis. Do I have any other apologies for absence? I don't seem to. Thank you very much. Agenda item 2, declarations of interest. Are there any declarations of interests this evening? And I don't see any indicated. So, right, moving straight on to the purpose of our meeting this evening, our single agenda item, the auditor's statutory recommendations issued under Section 24 under the Local Audit and Accountability Act of 2014. I call upon the leader, Councillor Ashby.
Thank you, Chair. I firstly would like to thank Sarah Ironmonger and her team for the diligent work in the production of the report and recommendations by examining the governance and financial sustainability at the Council. When I was elected, I made it clear that good governance is the cornerstone of effective local government. It is only right and proper that councillors have the opportunity to ask questions of the external auditor, agree to its recommendations and to be part of the process. I am pleased that by identifying areas of concern and making the recommendations of actions to be taken, the agreement tonight will enable the first steps towards us building a sound future for this council. Therefore, I ask members to support the proposal of: firstly, agree the recommendations as set out in the report from Grant Thornton. Secondly, to agree the actions which Grant Thornton have proposed to include updates at the various stages to the full council. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much indeed, Leader. Do you have a seconder? Yes. Councillor Everett. Thank you very much. I call upon now Mr. Dossett, the Head of Local Government for Grant Thornton, and Miss Ironmonger, Director of Audit at Grant Thornton, to present their report. I believe, Mr. Dossett, you're going to make the first presentation.
Thank you, Chairman, and good evening, members. Sarah will shortly take you through the report, but I just wanted to say some things to start with. First of all, statutory recommendations are not common. In the past couple of years, we've seen in total 4 public interest reports, which is a sort of higher level version, as it were, and 7 statutory recommendation reports issued. So it's a relatively rare thing. I have to say it's becoming less rare. There are a number of issues at a number of councils that have given rise to these types of reports in the last couple of years, but they are very important. Secondly, statutory recommendations will require a response and accountability from the council as a whole, hence presenting the report to full council, and therefore all members will both hear what Sarah's got to say and the recommendations, and obviously be part of owning the action. This is not an individual thing, this is a collective council responsibility. Thirdly, I would point out the consequences of inaction. So if we are not satisfied with progress after a reasonable period of time, we will have to consider what are the next steps from our point of view. Now, that's something we have to consider and give due consideration to at the time, but the more obvious next step would be public interest report, and any council who's received a public interest report would say they really don't want to receive one of those ever again. And finally, just for clarity for members, once we've gone through the process of presenting the report and then members are asking us questions, we will not be answering questions about individuals, we'll be answering questions about the report and the recommendations that we made and why we've made them, etc., etc. But just for clarity, we will not be answering questions about individuals. So I will now hand over to Sarah, who will take you through the report.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dossett. Ms. Armonger.
Thank you, Chair. As Paul has said, this is an unusual situation and it reflects a complex and sensitive set of circumstances. Our report reflects our view of the situation, and whilst we're not here to discuss individuals, we do want to talk to you about the arrangements. So now that I have the microphone in the correct place, all I was saying was it's an unusual set of circumstances, and our report reflects our view of the situation. So what is clear to us is that the arrangements that you have in place to respond to alleged whistleblowing, grievances and disciplinary procedures are not adequate. And this is shown through the impact in terms of the length of time matters are taking to resolve and the financial cost to resolve those matters. This started with the management of an initial allegation which was considered by the General Purposes Committee in 2019. But the response to that initial allegation drew in various senior officers, and the situation has continued for an extended period of time. And the council's governance arrangements have not been sufficient to manage that situation in a timely manner. And if you can see on page 3 where we talk about some of those issues, so the failure to adopt promptly the governance principles of the Joint Negotiating Committee for Chief Officers. There is an argument that if those were issued in 2015, if the council had adopted them by the time the issues arose in 2019, you would have had a framework to deal with this. There are a number of whistleblowing cases, grievance and disciplinary cases, and there is a need to deal with the outcomes of those promptly and systematically. And the process for managing those, because it wasn't done in a systematic way, led to a number of escalations. And again, when the General Purposes Committee considered matters, on occasions there was a lack of clarity around the action, and then that led to further escalation. There there have been situations where there have been perceived and actual conflicts of interest, and by not addressing those, that's added to further tension and further escalation. And as the situation developed, it brought in senior officers, and members needed to have been involved at an earlier stage because of the seniority of the officers drawn into the process. You did establish an IDSC, an Investigatory Disciplinary Subcommittee in 2020, and that progressed matters to a certain extent. But I think as the situation developed, what has happened is a range of reports and reviews were commissioned from independent reviewers. And I mentioned these on page 4, that we've had access to 8 such reports. Whilst the reports might raise concern about conduct of individuals, our concern is about how the council has responded to the reports. We would have expected clear action to be taken in response to externally commissioned reports. And in our view, effort was directed towards discrediting those reports for procedural matters rather than focusing on the substance of the matters in the report. And so this is, there's an example of a whistleblowing allegation, which was, whilst it was deemed not to meet the definition of a whistleblowing allegation, what we'd expect is for you as a council to understand the substance of the matter, even if it doesn't meet a technicality of a whistleblowing. So when we step back and look at all of the reports collectively, we're of the view that the council's response has not been adequate, and there are some significant consequences of that, and we set those out on page 5. So the financial cost, both in terms of the amount you've had to spend commissioning reviews, responding to them, as well as the potential additional costs if you don't deal with these matters properly, then employment tribunals may levy fines on you for a remedy. Those are significant. We talk about in the paper around your financial position being fragile, and we said in our previous reports that there's very little headroom to cope with any further cost pressures. Well, this has been a cost pressure that you have. As a result of these matters, there are cost pressures, additional ones you need to be responding to. One of the other consequences is there's been an awful lot of time used by senior officers and members trying to deal with these matters. That time and that energy needs to be directed towards the functions and delivering the services of Thanet Council. Because this has gone on for so long, there's this perception that the management culture is not going to respond to concerns. Now, culture is difficult to define, perception is difficult to define, but this has come through in the work that we've done. And importantly, I think your duty of care as a council to your officers has been compromised because it has taken a long time to deal with this, and individuals have suffered significant reputation damage because there have been leaks of some of the information, and as an employer of the people involved, that duty of care is not there. So what we are saying is the situation at Thanet does not represent good governance. We consider urgent action is needed to stabilise the situation and to rebuild trust in the council from a residents, from an officers and from a member's perspective. So we have set out 4 recommendations which we consider will address the situation and move you as a council forward, and those are set out in the report. So just to talk through the first couple on page 7, we are saying that we want a systematic review of all cases outstanding so that there is a risk assessment about what the options to resolve all those outstanding cases are. We are saying an experienced independent monitoring officer because there are lots of views whether they're about real and perceived conflicts of interest, so somebody that you can all agree is independent of you looking at this. We've suggested an experienced monitoring officer because that's a term that is commonly understood within local government. So there's a systematic review. There's also just an assessment of where some of those outstanding cases are and what your plan of action to address them is. And as part of that, I think it's really important to assess all those different reports that have come in and create a lessons learned document so that you can all ensure that this is not a situation that repeats. The second recommendation is about the IDSC process, and progress is ongoing with that. On the next page, we talk about the financial sustainability, and I've mentioned that it's a fragile space. Spending on the matters in our report has added further challenge to your financial gap, and as a council you are going to need to address that gap as part of setting your budget and a future medium-term financial strategy. Our fourth recommendation is as we've worked through this, it's clear to us there's not always a shared understanding of where officers and member responsibilities lie. We believe you need to be very clear, all of you, on that shared understanding, and that you are clear which matters sit where, so that you can rebuild that trust for everybody around, both members, officers and residents. That's all I was proposing to say on that, and we will take questions, Chair.
Yes, thank you very much indeed, Ms Ironmonger. Now, members will have the opportunity to ask the external auditors questions. When asking questions, would members please refrain from referencing individuals, and please be aware that the auditors will not be able to comment on individual cases. Now, I propose to break this down such that, as Ms Ironmonger has indicated, we take questions first before moving on to debate in the usual manner. So, questions please first, members. Councillor Orban.
Thank you, Chair. It's something that Mr Dossett said in his opening. It was in relation to a reasonable time for these actions to be implemented. Could you define what you consider to be a reasonable time? Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Orban. Mr Dossett.
Thank you, Chairman. A reasonable time, obviously you have to develop an action plan and start to deliver it, so we're not talking about weeks or even a couple of months, but I would expect within a 6-month period that substantive progress has been made. I mean, that's not a cut-off point, but if we were looking at this in May 2022, I'd expect substantial progress to have been made.
Thank you. Councillor Garner.
Thank you. Well, firstly, thank you, Sarah and the team, for the work you've done producing this comprehensive report, which we have here this evening. I've got a single question now, because the other one Councillor Orban has asked. But this question I'd like to ask is in the context of some of the details that you've mentioned that are captured in the body of the report, the details that include the catalogue of failures in the Council's governance process, the serious breakdown in relationships between senior officers over the last few years, and most importantly, as you mentioned, the findings in the 8 separate independently produced reports you've examined into the numbered specific whistleblowing, grievance and disciplinary cases. These reports, I think, as you said, as well as identifying clear evidence of bullying of whistleblowers and of whistleblowers being subject to unwarranted disciplinary action themselves, also contained recommendations that were either misinterpreted, ignored or discredited. And they also confirmed that although the Council has appropriate policies and procedures for dealing with grievances and staff performance issues, on a number of occasions these were not adhered to by senior officers. So my question is, while I agree with the actions outlined in the report and look forward to the independent monitoring officer being appointed as soon as possible to get on with the job, what can we do in the meantime to make sure that any existing or new grievance and whistleblowing cases are dealt with appropriately, rather than in the manner you've identified they've been dealt with over the last few years? Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Garner. Mr Dossett.
I will start with answering some of these questions. My colleague here, who, apologies, we didn't introduce, Tom Foster, did some of the work with me, so at points we may need to answer together. So I think there are matters that your reports have come through, and the reports have all gone to the IDSC. I think it's important that there is a process that is followed, and you're going to need assurance that the process is being systematically followed going forward from here. I think our recommendation about the monitoring officer reviewing everything that is there, because in a large organisation there will always be some elements of complaints, and we need that systematic assessment of both, is there an issue, because just because someone makes an allegation doesn't necessarily make that allegation an issue. Is there an issue? What is the best way of resolving that and being proactive in resolving those? So there's the historic piece, which they can collate that. I think you need to be really clear on a set of, and this monitoring officer may well help you with that, about what your process should be and how do you get assurance on it. In a council without these issues, you'd have arrangements set up, and perhaps someone like internal audit might review them and say, yes, they're working as we expected. You may want some greater assurance on that because of the historic issues.
Thank you, Ms Ironmonger. Yes. Thank you, Councillor Garner. Councillor Austin.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Ms Ironmonger, for your report. I'm a new councillor. I've only been in the role for 6 months, but in a long period of work in the public sector, I've rarely come across such a shocking catalogue of problems as we have here, and I hold us as councillors responsible for it. We should have created a better governance environment, and it's up to us to do something about it. So I'm thoroughly in support of your recommendations. The thing I wanted to ask was about the scope of the independent monitoring officer's work with us. Most particularly, I'm thinking about the area around shared understanding about members and officers' roles and the building up of trust. I've never come across a council where elected members are held at arm's length from decision making as much as happens in this council. And I don't mean just decision making with regard to personnel issues, which obviously are a different matter, but more generally. And this, in my view, stems from decisions taken by our predecessor council between 2015 and 2019.
Ms Austin, could I have a question, please? We can move on to debate after.
Who changed our constitution and our member officer protocol and our scheme of delegation. Is there scope for the independent monitoring officer to look at those matters, because I am concerned that without a fundamental review of these issues, we're not actually going to be able to move forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms Ironmonger.
So thank you for summarising. I think our view would be that it is up to everyone in this room, the councillors in this room, to ensure that you move forward with this situation. In regard to the specifics, I think it isn't unusual for councils, for members and officers not to necessarily agree where the line is between what's an officer and a member responsibility. I think what we are saying is that we have had so much correspondence where that it's clear that you do not all have a shared understanding of that. We are not saying whether it's right or wrong. We are saying you need to have a shared understanding so that you can all function, both officers and members. You all need to be clear on that. I think in terms of the way you've chosen to do your constitution, that is not something that is for me to speak to. That is something that you, as your democratic process, respond to.
Thank you very much for that. Do I have Councillor Keane? I think indicated yes.
Thank you. Just a short question. On the first recommendation, you've got about the independent monitoring officer reporting to the General Purposes Committee. Given our shared responsibility as councillors, why is it not coming straight back to full council?
Thank you, Ms Armbruster.
Yes, so as a council, you will want progress against all of these recommendations coming back to you, because it's about the independent monitoring officer going through individual cases. If there are actions that need to be taken against those individual cases, that would normally go to the General Purposes Committee to go through that detail. So that's why we were suggesting that. What you as a council may want is maybe some headline figures from the monitoring officer. We've looked at this many are going here. So you know what the progress is, but in terms of the detail, then that needs to sit where if you're going through an individual person's case, that needs to sit in the right place within your constitution.
Thank you for that. Councillor Yates.
Thank you very much for the report. I've just got 3 questions. The first is, you've highlighted that there's been a failure to manage whistleblowing cases, grievances and disciplinary cases and their outcomes promptly and systematically. In regards to the definition of the word systematically, sorry to get into definitions, does that mean that certain cases weren't followed chronologically? My second question is, you mentioned discrediting external reports. I'm just wondering whether this is a common situation found amongst councils, or whether this is actually quite, how serious is that kind of situation. And lastly, just on the first recommendation and the external monitoring officer, you're saying that they can commission, they can look at externally commissioned reports and any other appropriate evidence. I'm just wondering, with any other appropriate evidence, can they carry out interviews with members and officers? So those are my 3 questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Councillor Yates. Councillor Ms Armbruster, you've got 3 questions.
Thank you. So when we say systematically, we have got examples where things were not done in a chronological order. Now, there may, if you do a very detailed risk assessment, you may need to do things out of chronological order, but you need to have very clear systems about how you make that risk assessment and the choices you're making as to why you aren't doing something in a chronological order. So I think that would be my answer to that. Paul is going to respond to your second question.
Yeah, in terms of discrediting external reports, I would say that I find that very unusual in my experience of local government. The reality of local government is it is done to by a range of things, and there's all sorts of regulators and checkers who will do reports, some invited, some imposed. It's very unusual, whatever members or officers think about these reports, to have a process of discrediting them. So I would normally expect councils to accept reports and move forward in the appropriate way to address the recommendations such reports make.
And I didn't quite get the full detail of your third question.
So my third question is just about the external monitoring officer being hired. Are they going to be able, as part of gathering any other appropriate evidence, to be able to carry out interviews with officers and members?
So one of the reasons we've said an experienced independent monitoring officer is so that they can bring their experience to bear of what needs to be done in an individual situation. I don't think we would want to limit their scope, because they need to follow what evidence is there. If they're following up individual cases, they are going to need to interview officers, because that would be part of it. I think the involvement of members is something that I think we'd all need to think carefully through about where members' role fits in terms of their actual investigation, because the recommendation as written is going through the cases that are there and being really clear about those. So unless any of those involved members, that's not what we had envisaged, it may be something different that you're looking for.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I have Councillor Green. Sorry about that. Thank you very much.
I would like to thank, sorry, I'll get my glasses on. I would like to thank Sarah Ironmonger of Grant Thornton for the thorough, clear, well-evidenced and concise report, but one I found a harrowing read for obvious reasons, both in terms of human suffering and the waste of financial spending which we can ill afford. I've got 4 questions and I will get there, please, Chair. I'm particularly concerned about that despite 8 previous reports by 6 external independent reviewers, commissioned and paid for by us, covering the last 2.5 years, there was clearly no real effort or attempt made to address the serious issues. Indeed, they were allowed to escalate instead of taking action, as the report says, to address the substance of the findings. It also appears further opportunities were sadly missed in July when Grant Thornton wrote to the Council raising concerns in private. Whilst not diminishing the human suffering this ongoing situation must have caused and is still causing, I cannot help but be shocked by the staggering amount of council taxpayers' money that has been wasted as a direct consequence of both the longevity and a failure to act decisively and effectively according to repeated external warnings.
Councillor Wing, whereas we may agree with you, could we have the questions,
I'm getting
please?
there. As a result, I welcome the recommendations made under Section 24, Schedule 7 of the Local Audit and Accountability Act 2014. Things have to change, and I now feel we've reached a critical mass of support. My questions are, given the failure to act over the last 2.5 years, how can we therefore be certain that this report will result in the issues highlighted being addressed? 2. The 4 areas of recommendations set out clear objectives, with 2 areas falling under the responsibility of the leader and the CEO. With senior officers mentioned throughout this report, is this not a conflict of interest? And are we simply not allowing the same repeated pattern of behaviour to continue? How will this potential conflict of interest be safeguarded against? Question 3. As an elected member, I remain frustrated about the lack of clarity between officers and members' responsibilities. Will the recommendations in this report therefore facilitate constructive input and concerns from elected members and residents? Question 4. We do not presently have a 151 officer, sadly. Would this be a good opportunity to bring in an experienced and independent 151 officer, as we are doing with the 141 officer, to lead on the financial recommendations, given the critical nature of these? Thank you.
Thank you. Ms Ironmonger.
So, in response to your first question about progress, as my colleague said, we will be keeping an eye on progress, and if we deem that progress is insufficient, then we would have to consider what action we need to take next. It is unusual for us to have to escalate, but we have that ability. What I would hope is at the end of this that you do work on an action plan, and that you all take responsibility for making sure there is progress on that action plan that is within the council's ability to respond to. So that will be where that progress is. In terms of the response about whether it's the leader and the chief exec, this is about being really clear that the leader is the leader of you as elected members, the Chief Exec Officer is the head of paid service. Both those roles are vital for the running of the council, and they need to work together. And therefore, it needs, as I said, it needs to be rebuilding the trust of everybody, and therefore both need to agree. And if there's no agreement, then I think that would be something that would concern us significantly. The lack of clarity around where elected member roles and officers sits is very much what that 4th recommendation is about, and you would need to have constructive conversations involving everybody to reach a common understanding of it. And I think, as I said earlier, it's not uncommon for that not to be entirely clear at certain authorities, but a lot of effort goes into making that shared understanding clear, so the frustration that some of you are expressing has got an ability to be worked through. In terms of your Section 151 officer, I think yes, you don't have, you have an acting 151 officer. I think in terms of the actual recommendation here, it's about being really clear about what plans to address the financial, additional financial pressure. It is not quite as sensitive as the other issues that are there, which is why we suggested that the 151 and the Cabinet portfolio holder can be. It is for the Council to decide who you get to do that.
Thank you very much indeed. Councillor Linda Piper.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for your report, Sarah. Going to the first recommendation, commission an experienced independent monitoring officer from a large local authority. And I'm sure all of us here would agree with that. But then you also said that it needs to be an independent monitoring officer that we all agree to appoint. So are there any guidelines how we can all put our input in to the suitability of this independent monitoring officer? Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Piper. Ms Armanga.
Thank you. So the responsibility sits with the leader and the chief exec, as per my recommendation. I think you can have your views with the leader, who will be the person representing all the elected members. The chief exec will presumably take responses from any officers who want to have a view on that. I think the key here is that you can agree that the person who is brought in is independent, who doesn't have a history of working with you, who has not been involved in any of these details before. But the chief...
Excuse me.
The leader...
Look, we are trying to run a meeting here to achieve a result this evening. Barracking is not going to help us in that respect. So can we please have some quiet while we carry on with proceedings? Thank you.
We consider the leader has the stature, the leader of any council should have the stature to be able to have that conversation and represent your views, because you have elected that person as your leader.
Thank you very much. Councillor Ashby.
Thank you, Chair. I'd just like to assure members, as your elected leader, that I will ensure that this report is carried out in the correct manner and the selection of the monitoring officer is done, the independent monitoring officer is done in the correct manner, and it will be followed through. As you all know, that I stand very high on the platform of governance, and I just want to reassure you, Councillor Wing, but all councillors, that this will be dealt with, and we will see the right results, and we will come out the other side and have a council where we can all be proud of and work with. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Councillor Ashby. You're going to say?
And I'd like to assure members that I have every confidence in our acting 151 officer, and I hope that you will also support him in the role. He's actually got a big, heavy workload on, but he's more than capable of carrying out the role that we're asking him to do. So I'd ask members to support that as well.
Thank you very much indeed, Councillor Ashby, and I think that launches us nicely into debate if members would like to get involved. Do I have somebody who would like to? Councillor Everett.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to stand up. We seem not to be standing up this evening. I think perhaps we've been in front of our computer screens for too long. We've forgotten the practice of standing up. I'd also like to thank the external auditor for her recommendations and the work that she's done on the Council's behalf. I fully support her recommendations on behalf of the Labour Group, and I want to be clear that I absolutely recognise the narrative set out in the background notes and the need for a Section 24 notice. It is a shocking narrative, but sadly it is not a shock to those who have been exposed to the events of the last 2 years at first hand. All of us will recognise that what it describes is a grotesque waste of public money and both officer and member time, and it should not have happened. I think it's probably better to wait for the lessons learnt report from an independent monitoring officer before we try to explore in any detail how it did come about. but I will say that the Council's lack of adopted policies to manage grievances and disciplinary allegations against and between the statutory officers, including a lack of clarity about the role of elected members, was indeed a major factor. Whether it was Councillor Bayford as leader before me or during my own tenure, trying to navigate the situation that we found ourselves in without that clarity and with all the people that you would normally rely on to advise you conflicted was extremely challenging. That is one reason that the Council incurred such substantial legal expenses. The other was the sheer complexity of matters that were already in train by October 2019. But these matters were not caused by members, and indeed this has never been a matter of party politics. Our responsibility tonight is to support the recommendations and then to take on board the findings of the external monitoring officer to ensure that we can never be in the same situation again. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Councillor Everett, and I think that does encapsulate very well exactly the position we need to take this evening. Councillor Piper.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Much of what any of us will say this evening is, I'm sure, already well understood, but I think it is important that for the benefit of the public who are not imminently party to what we're doing, that these things are set out. The decision taken by Grant Thornton, we've already had some hints about it, to issue this report under Section 24, Schedule 7 of the Local Audit and Accountability Act is clearly not one they've taken lightly. And we have now this evening been advised they have additional powers to issue a public interest report if our response is considered ineffective. Such a public interest report was issued in Croydon this time last year and in Nottingham in August 2020. These are, just as Mr. Dossett indicated, very serious matters and we shouldn't shy away from them. Clearly, as a body of public servants, we simply have to accept these recommendations. Chairman, we have the background reasons that led to these recommendations, and we have to admit it is a damning report of failures of governance, and we have to take it on the chin. Though the bulk of the criticisms are detailed on pages 3 and 4, it should be noted that elected members of this council do not escape criticism entirely. On page 6, the position described, I quote, "The position described represents a failure of governance with," and the second sentence is, "members not taking effective action early in some instances." Not an isolated incident, but in instances plural. We should have taken action in the past and we did not. Chairman, we have not had an opportunity as a body of elected representatives to discuss this report and decide on our response to it. I'm not talking about the council as a complete body, I'm talking about the council in terms of elected members, so we can genuinely voice our concerns. All of which begs the question, are we, the elected members, in danger of being muzzled in our response to this report? How are we to know if this report will be effective enough to head off a public interest report or even court action as a worst case scenario? For self-evident legal reasons, we cannot identify individuals in this public forum. So when may I ask, we going to be able to discuss these matters? Are we to assume, Mr. Chairman, that the appointment of the independent monitoring officer will allow these background issues to be properly investigated, including why members did not act or felt they could not act, so that we then can have an effective contribution to any action plan that may be implemented? If we are to wait for their contribution, and I think we should, then clearly we will not be able to implement final recommendation strategies during November 2021, as is detailed on the last page of the report. It seems to me there may be more than a little temptation to skip to the cure before adequately and thoroughly diagnosing the illness. Grant Thornton have supplied this report using this act, which has the word accountability in it, and I would like some guidance, please. Surely it cannot be that the word accountability only applies to figures and money any more than the word governance does, because if that were true, this report would only concentrate on money, figures and balance sheets, and clearly it does a great deal more than that. Accountability must surely include responsibility for the failings and a need to hold people to account. We have seen the public's condemnation of those responsible for the failings at Southern Water in this area in which we live, and we are now seeing public outrage at the failings in their council here at TDC. We have to get this right, because the public do have every right, I believe, to hold this council to account for this damning report. And sadly, for many of us who are elected members, it may well be that the election system that approaches in a little over a year's time, that the public, through their frustration, may just choose to sack the members if they feel they have no other voice and no other way to complain about what's going on. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much indeed, Councillor Piper. I don't think we can preempt exactly the intentions of the report and the action resulting therein, but perhaps Sarah Armunger would like to comment.
In terms of accountability, yes, you're right. It covers more than just finances, and the external audit role includes looking at value for money arrangements, which includes governance, which is where this work comes through from. I think you're right to raise the point that the electorate will take a view on the progress that you make. The accountability, I think you have to see what the situation is once that systematic review has gone through of all the cases, because it is not possible to extrapolate from the one or two or handful of cases we have looked at. We are saying the situation is not right for the council and the council needs to move forward. We are not saying what you should do about any individual, because there is not sufficient evidence to tell you that.
Thank you very much indeed for that. Do I have another speaker? I don't seem to. Can we... sorry, Councillor Yates.
Yeah, I'm just trying to follow up on what Ms. Armunger told me earlier about appropriate evidence, and obviously that we've been speaking about member involvement tonight, and I'm just concerned about whether this independent monitoring officer can conduct interviews with both officers and members. And I did get the impression that members weren't going to be interviewed as part of this process, so from my side I think it's important to have that ability for the independent monitoring officer to potentially interview both officers and members. So from my side, I think I'd like to propose an amendment where we include interviews as part of the third bullet point on the first item on page 7, to include interviews with any officers and members where appropriate, because I think from what we've seen tonight, members need to take more responsibility, and if maybe there is a chance for us to have our voices heard where appropriate from that independent monitoring officer, I think it's important it's done.
Thank you very much, Councillor. We'll come to that. Now, I have to say, we cannot have interruptions like this and barracking from the gallery. This serves no purpose. Your elected representatives are addressing the issues. There's no need to turn this into some sort of barracking fight. So thank you very much, Councillor Yates. Councillor Austin.
Can I second Councillor Yates's proposal? If we are going to take responsibility, we have to have direct contact with the independent monitoring officer. I don't mean every individual councillor, but there has to be that facility. And it's very difficult for us to take responsibility given our current constitution. We're in a situation where sensitive decisions are taken on the council's behalf and Cabinet find out about them afterwards. We're in a situation where a member of this council has had to submit a freedom of information request in order to find out what her own council is doing in her own ward. This is not acceptable. We have to have a means by which members can put input into this process, and at the moment we can't see a way to find that. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Councillor Austin. I mean, the thing about this is we're making an addition. I did actually feel in my reading of the report that that was covered. However, I can turn to Ms Austin to ask if that would be appropriate addition to the recommendations. I'm sorry, Miss Ironmonger, got mixed up there.
Sorry, Chairman, I'll take that question. Just for clarity, our report is our report, so we don't amend our recommendations. They are our recommendations. Of course, how the council chooses to take things forward in the context of the points raised is for the council to decide. What I would say is I would expect, if you appointed the right calibre of independent monitoring officer, this would be someone with vast experience of dealing with these types of matters and dealing with members. I would expect them to take a balanced view on who they spoke to and how they took on board the communication from that person, whether members or officers. So I would expect them to make that judgment. I don't think it's about having rules in place that say they must speak to X number of councillors or officers. I'd expect an independent, strong monitoring officer to speak to councillors as appropriate, right? And it's perfectly reasonable for councillors to ask to speak to the monitoring officer about matters of concern. I think there has to be a very, very clear distinction, though, between broader matters of constitutional and other concern and individual cases, because that is not for members to be involved in, but it is for members to engage with a strong independent monitoring officer role. So that would be my view.
Councillor Ashby.
Thank you, Chair. I think being too prescriptive with sub-proposals is probably counterproductive, on the basis that if you start to set parameters around it, then that's somewhat restricting the monitoring officer, the independent monitoring officer. I would rather that it is understood, and I believe this would be acceptable, that in the plan project that the monitoring or independent monitoring officer is given absolutely free rein with absolutely anything, and that will be certainly something that I will be putting in the plan as I see it, and I can see no reason why that wouldn't be the way that it goes forward. So rather than having proposals that make it restrictive, which I think would be counterproductive, that it is understood here and now and agreed that this independent monitoring officer, apart from obviously having the experience of being able to come in and deal with this particular special project, as we'd like to think it to be, that they would have free rein to go absolutely anywhere they want to, and I can't see any reason why that would be a problem. So we'll have that assurance now.
Thank you very much indeed, Councillor Wing.
I'd like to support that. I mean, I find it as again, I'm a fairly new first-time elected councillor, and I am that councillor that had 2 freedom of information requests rejected after a polite request for information in my ward. One of which is presently 11 months out of date, and monitoring officers refuse to even answer my emails. So that is the type of culture that some councillors are operating in. I'd also like to state here and now that early on in our tender, when our Green leader here, Trevor Roper, was here, we got a suspicion that some of our emails were actually being intercepted, and this was confirmed, and I'm quite happy that email's been passed over.
Councillor Wing, look, there's no evidence for that. There is no evidence for that, and you've got to be very careful about making accusations like that.
I have the email.
Unless you're prepared to substantiate that here and now. I'm talking, Councillor Wing, I'm talking. Councillor Wing. To make accusations like that without presenting facts here at this council is dangerous.
I will read a quote from the email
I'm sorry,
that I will send
no,
to
can you
tomorrow.
curtail this and
in some
stick to
limited
the
exceptional
stick to discussing?
circumstances, emails
Stick
to
to
the individual's
discussing the
email
agenda.
addresses are directed to an officer at a single point of contact. That officer then checks the contents of the email. I will pass that email on. This is the culture that we are having to operate as elected members as well. So I welcome the leaders' widening of the monitoring officers, the independent monitoring officers' scope. Thank you.
I'm a bit disappointed by that, Councillor Wing. Right, Councillor Yates, did you wish to come back in?
Yeah, just following on from what the leader has said, I'm happy to withdraw that proposal for an amendment. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Councillor Yates. Do I have any other speakers? No, we don't. Well, I propose we go ahead with voting for acceptance of the report this evening. We've got both recommendations and an action to vote in favour or against or abstain from. Yes, I've just been minded that in actual Councillor Ashby in her presentation did present the case for regular updates to Council, and that will be included as part of our agreement for the recommendations. Councillor Piper, did you want to come back in?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just for some clarity, really, we're about to vote, and I'm sure we're all of a mind to accept the recommendations. Part 2 says, what, if any, action to take in response to these recommendations. I'm not quite sure, apart from a general agreement that we would give the independent monitoring officer complete free rein to guide us and lead us. Quite apart from that, I'm not quite sure that we are in a position to say what action we will take. So do we need a simple sentence which is at least an action to begin with that then leads us on to further actions as they may become necessary as the independent monitoring officer does their work? Thank you.
Yes, Councillor Piper, I rather feel that would follow necessarily and quite naturally from the work that the independent monitoring officer would undertake. Nevertheless, I turn to Ms Armmonger for advice.
Yes, so we have given you recommendations. It's your implementation that you need to do next. You've voted for action. I think that the next stage is getting into a detailed action plan of quite what those, breaking it right down so that you all have clarity about what those actions are and the time frame you're going to do those in. And that's the sort of piece that we will be really monitoring you on. You will want to be sure amongst yourselves that you think that the actions are appropriate for the recommendations we have made.
Thank you very much indeed, Ms Armmonger. Can I move to a vote, therefore? Councillor Ashby, you want to come back in?
Thank you, Chair. Can I request a recorded vote, please?
Of course, yes. We'll proceed with a recorded vote for recommendations to be accepted and the action proposed to be accepted. Those in favour of acceptance of the report?
Thank you very much, Chair. I'll just read out everybody's names, and if you would kindly say whether you're in favour of the recommendations in the report, with Councillor Ashby's slight amendment about doing regular updates to Council, you're against or you abstain. Okay, is that all right? So, Councillor Alban.
For.
Councillor Ara.
For.
Councillor Ashby.
For.
Councillor Austin.
For.
Councillor Bailey. 4. Councillor Bambridge. Councillor Braidwood.
4.
Councillor Coleman Cook.
4.
Councillor Crittenden.
4.
Councillor Curry.
4.
Councillor Day. Councillor Dexter. Councillor Duckworth.
4.
Councillor Everett. Councillor Farrance.
4.
Councillor Fellows. Councillor Garner.
4.
Councillor Gregory.
4.
Councillor Hart.
4.
Councillor Hopkinson.
4.
Councillor Keane.
4.
Councillor Cupp.
4.
Councillor Lays. Councillor Pat Moore.
4.
Councillor Paul Moore.
4.
Councillor Ovenden. Councillor Parsons. Councillor Linda Piper. Councillor Stuart Piper. Councillor Potts.
4.
Councillor Pugh. Councillor Rattigan. Councillor Rolfe.
4.
Councillor Rogers. Councillor Rizeki.
4.
Councillor David Saunders. Councillor Maeve Saunders. Councillor Savage.
4.
Councillor Scobie. Councillor Scott. Councillor Shrub. Councillor Tomlinson. Councillor Towning. Councillor Wallin. Councillor Whitehead.
4.
Councillor Wing.
4.
Councillor Wright.
4.
And Councillor Yates. That's unanimous, Chair.
That is unanimous, members. That therefore concludes the business of the meeting of the Council this evening. Thank you very much indeed.